Howdy, my name is Casey Dacey, and welcome to my presentation on what the deal is with O1. So, the thing about him is that, it's kind of boring. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. I promise this presentation is going to be me dunking on the hero for 20 minutes. Matter of fact, we'll start with the biggest thing about them. And as you can see, it is pretty big. Barrier is probably the most interesting thing that O1 has. It's one of the best methods to sustain in the entire game, which is always appreciated. There's a catch though. It has a hard cap at 3 barrier, which is what you start at the beginning of the game, meaning you can't just play super defensively and stack up to 30 health because you felt like it. So then what do you do with all the health if you can't stockpile it? Well, counterintuitively, you want to get hit so that you can get more barrier over the course of the game. You can basically take free hits every couple of turns to still get block charge out of it. This allows you to develop unopposed threats or make greedier plays without having to worry about getting punished as harshly as other heroes would for making the same risky choices. Being able to use health as a resource like this is honestly really interesting. Speaking of which, that's not all. O1's heroics are very consistent. They come in 2 flavors, dealing direct damage and keeping allies alive. To add to consistency, both types of heroics achieve the same thing, maintaining your tempo. Regardless of whether you're playing aggressive or defensive, there's a solid chance that you have a heroic that can reinforce your board state, usually protecting a key unit against whatever your opponent decides to respond to it with. Other heroes like Alpha have heroics that do very different things, and while that does give them versatility, if they draw the wrong heroic at the wrong time, they're very sad about it and can potentially lose the game. O1 doesn't really have this problem. You can opt to make riskier plays on turns you otherwise be scared to make, because you have a 1-cost action that, 9 times out of 10, can respond to whatever your opponent throws your way. It's not all sunshines and rainbows though, because there are some things that O1 begins to struggle with. Namely the fact that he isn't fun. But for real, O1 has a unique issue in that they themselves can't really push a game plan and thus are heavily reliant on their main deck of cards to do the heavy lifting. That might sound weird at first since every half-decent deck is playing towards some kind of win condition, but what I mean by that is that O1 the hero doesn't really have anything crazy that calls out a win. They don't have like access to a powerful stat buff like Snap or Kazoo. They don't have ways of dealing bonus attacks like Eve or Anastasia, and they don't really have a means of cheating out resources like Sumi or Zac. Now, don't get me wrong, O1 is really good at maintaining an advantage or neutralizing your opponent's plays, but they can't really snowball or close out games on their own. They're reliant on cards in their deck to do that for them more than any other hero. Additionally, O1's lack of card generation means that although they can live longer than the average hero, after a certain point, the game becomes more value-centric, where characters with way more ways of creating resources, like Phil and Ahri, are much more favorable in the short-term survivability that O1 provides. O1 also doesn't really have a solid means of taking out high health units, meaning they don't really do well against strategies that have singular large threats. Namely, against ramp decks, they kinda just boned. Okay, so I'm going to show you a list of cards that work really well with O1 now. And they all have something in common. I want you to take a look at the list and see what you think it is. Like, I'll give you a few seconds before you can see it. Yep, they all have the letter A in their name. So you might be wondering, okay, so why is Magfield so important to O1? Well, before we get into that, I think it is a good time to talk about old O1. Up until very recently, it was the April Fool patch, the one before the latest balance patch, that O1 received a passive rework that gave them what they currently have, which is the barrier mechanic. Before that though, O1 used to have armor 1 instead of barrier. This effectively does the same thing as it does now. It has a very similar idea. O1 is going to be taking less overall damage over the course of the game because they reduce all sources of damage by 1. Unfortunately, this ended up being a very polarizing passive, because if you were an aggressive deck and you saw O1, you basically lost the game before you got into the mulligan, and if you were playing like a ramp deck or a control deck into O1, you basically won the game before the mulligan, because the armor 1 passive is just that polarizing. And during this time, people started to experiment with Magnetic Field, since the card also had armor, meaning that any damage that your hero would take would be reduced by 1 and redirected to it. Now, when the hero is O1, that would mean that the damage is reduced by 2. 1 from getting reduced by O1, 1 from getting reduced by Magfield. The damage mitigation fucking stat. But yeah, to this day, Magfield still remains as one of O1's best options for a 1-drop. Not only do you have barrier to keep your HP topped off, running Magfield allows you even more protection even when the shit hits the fan. You also have access to a lot of ways of making Magfield effectively immortal, which means you can't die for the turn, because normally any damage that you would take goes to Magfield and then Magfield takes it and then it would die and then you would take damage as normal. But with these cards, you would take the damage, it would get redirected to Magfield, and then Magfield wouldn't take the damage. So you were effectively immortal unless your opponent had like a direct removal option that didn't deal damage. The main 3 cards that do this, with addition with Magfield, are Last Stand, Organization Guard, and Antivirus. That last one is important because that's one of your heroics. You just like have a 25% chance to draw a card that makes you immortal for the turn. It's kind of crazy. Another card worth mentioning is Avalanche. Slower 0-1 strategies begin to fall apart after surviving the early to mid game because you lack ways of creating card advantage and ways of closing out games. Avalanche remedies this by giving you a 1-card answer to the question, why is it turn 9 and my opponent still has 18 HP? Not really much else to say, it's just a good late game win con. We'll now be talking about some decks that I think the hero works really well with, and the first up is this Burn deck. Phil made this a while back, a couple patches ago, so some of the cards have been nerfed, but I can assure you they're not really struggling for damage. The game plan is simple: play defensively against more aggressive and tempo strategies, and aggressively against slower ones. You're basically just trying to do the opposite of what your opponent's trying to do. Your objective is to just chip your opponent as much as you can to set up your late game burn cards to finish off your opponent. It's pretty straightforward in concept, but does have a lot of interesting decision making in how you want to approach any given turn. Next up is Robots. 0-1 and more aggressive strategies allows you to actually have a game plan to play towards instead of just removing the board and doing fuck all else. The deck is also fairly straightforward. Play for a board in the early turns so you're able to set up a Cena, then just protect the queen at all costs while she scales your units to the moon. 0-1's heroics are particularly useful for this strategy because A, they do a really good job protecting Cena from any troublesome cards that want to get her, and B, most of them are robot cards, meaning Cena will buff your units when she sees them played. Yes, that is how that interaction works. It's stupid, I know. What's more, 0-1 is perfect at dealing with strategies that want to rush you down before you get set up, and while not an essential part of the strategy, Metalhead Red and Blue are solid cards on their own that once every couple of games can just rob a game out of nowhere with their gimmick. Okay, I'm gonna be real. I just want to see these two get played. They're really funny. But what if you want to play something a little slower? That's where this deck comes in. Your objective is to respond with everything your opponent throws at you to set up your Levy and Avalanche to win. Fortunately, this deck has a lot of ways to ensure that you make it that far. From cheap removal to AoE to freeze and kill effects, you have answers just about every situation. But don't get it twisted. This deck, more than any other of the ones that I mentioned, suffers from a lack of card draw. You need to make sure that every single card you play has to be as efficient as possible to make it for that effect. But play your cards right, and you'll be able to handle the scariest board stages without breaking a sweat. In conclusion, 0-1 is a defensive beast that can work in just about anything, but is heavily reliant on other OCs and actions to make up for the fact that their power budget is spent on not dying instead of killing the opponent. Now, I did say that they were kind of boring to play multiple times, but that's not so much because I hate playing 0-1, and more because I think you can do cooler, more degenerate, and fun things with the other heroes. Depending on whether or not I decide to make more of these, you'll see what I mean. But until then, thank you so much for watching.